and welcome to this video log on Unveiling Jesus Christ. I'm John Cassanet, and I'll be your tour guide as we visit the ancient city of Pergamum, or as they would say in the modern Greek language, Pergamos. This is now the modern town of Bergama, Turkey. Today we'll be visiting the acropolis, and I'll talk about the history of Pergamos during our gondola ride to the top of this hill. Before getting there, I wanted to briefly show you the Red Basilica, which is the second most famous historical land site in Bergama. Today, the Red Basilica is known as a ruined temple that was built during the Roman Empire, probably in the time of Hadrian around the 2nd century AD. It's also one of the largest Roman structures still surviving in the ancient Greek world and has a diameter of about 200 by 85 feet. The building actually began as a structure used in the worship of Egyptian gods, specifically Isis and or Serapis, and possibly also Osiris and Harpocrates. Some materials came from Egypt in the construction of this building. It has a pair of drum-shaped rotundas, both of which are intact alongside the main temple. Today, one of the rotundas is a mosque that is not open to the public, but the other was used for an olive oil factory machinery room, and there's black soot on the walls. The building is actually pretty huge, but only one part of a much larger sacred complex. The sacred structure was called the Temenos, most of which was destroyed and built over, but fragments of the walls still remain. The Temenos was 890 by 330 feet in diameter, surrounded by stone walls that were 43 feet tall. It was built of red brick, which was pretty common construction materials in Italy at the time. It also had 12 niches inside the temple with statues of gods, probably those of the zodiac. Interestingly enough, the entire complex was built directly over the river Salinas. So they had to build this bridge that was 643 feet wide and channel the river through these two tunnels underneath the temple. The Pergamum Bridge still stands, and it supports modern buildings and vehicle traffic. The tunnels, or the chambers, lie under the main temple, connecting it with the side rotundas. Now, this was probably done so that the temple could be built at the city center, and they didn't have to remove a whole bunch of buildings because it was just the river. So you build the tunnels underneath that the water can flow through, and voila, you have the Red Basilica. So the Romans converted the temple into a Christian church that was dedicated to St. John, but this was subsequently destroyed and gutted by fire, probably by the Arabs who looted the city in 716 to 717 AD. Much of the original temple was destroyed at that time, so essentially what you have is the inside shell of the destroyed temple that's left. Ultimately, Pergamum fell to the Turks in 1336 AD, and the building was converted into a mosque. German excavations began in about 1906 and continued by others since then. The South Rotunda was restored between 2006 and 2009. Okay, with that little bit of history about the Red Basilica, we're ready to hit the streets of Bergama again on our way to the gondola that will take us to the top of the acropolis where ancient Pergamos was located. On the way up, I'm going to give you some geographical information and a historical background about Pergamum, which is known as Pergamos in the book of Revelation. Pergamos was the northernmost city of the 7 churches of Asia that John wrote to in the book of Revelation. You'll find more details about this city in my Come Follow Me podcast number 6 from November 5th of 2023, and then I discuss specifically the verses in the book of Revelation that deal with this city in chapter 2 verses 12 through 17, and you'll find those podcasts on February 18, 24, 25, and also on March 2nd and 3rd of 2024. So we have a total of 6 different podcasts that discuss various aspects of this city, mostly from a spiritual standpoint of what John was writing to them in the book of Revelation. This was a city that was both commended and also criticized by John, but more about that later. So the city is located about 16 miles from the coastline of the Aegean Sea, And unlike Ephesus and Smyrna, it has a strongly inland character to it. The acropolis that we're headed up to in the gondola is on an 1,100-foot high mesa of andesite, which is a volcanic rock. It's accessible by what's known as the Bergama Acropolis gondola. The guide was kind of teasing with us when we were going and said the gondola is very safe before we got in it, and only 5 people had been killed in the gondola. So he was kind of messing with us, and he's sitting there telling us, well, I just hope it's not a windy day, blah, blah, blah. So the mountain on which the Acropolis sits is about 1/2 mile wide and a little over 3 miles long from north to south. At its highest point, it's called the Garden of the Queen. I'm now going to talk a little bit about the history of Pergamos that was settled as far back as the 8th century BC. By 281 BC, the Attalid dynasty began to rule Pergamos, which continued until 133 BC. During this time, Pergamos became a major cultural center of the Greek world. They had the library of Pergamum that was second only to the library of Alexandria in Egypt. Pergamum reached the zenith of its power and opulence between 197 and 138 BC. There were major changes made to the city on the Acropolis during this time, and the goal was to create a second Athens from a cultural and artistic standpoint in the Greek world. They actually remodeled the Acropolis in Pergamos after the Acropolis located in Athens, and it included the construction of these broad terraces. They also removed a lot of the earlier structures. So by 138 BC, they had reached the last of the Attalid kings because Attalus III died without an heir. By this time, they had become loyal supporters of Rome, and he bequeathed the whole of Pergamum to the Roman Empire. So during the Roman period, Pergamum went to war against Rome in 88 BC, and when Rome prevailed, Pergamos lost its status as a free city, and they had to pay tribute and accommodate and make supplies to the Roman troops. The property of many of the inhabitants was also confiscated. Nevertheless, Pergamum remained a famous city and the seat of the regional assembly. This was granted by the Emperor Augustus after 31 BC. Partly because Pergamos was one of the first provinces to embrace the imperial cult, that is, the worship of emperors. The aristocracy in Pergamos continued to reach the highest circles of power in the 1st century AD. Early in the 1st century, under Trajan, there was a comprehensive redesign and remodeling of the city. This involved the construction of a Roman new city at the base of the Acropolis. Emperor Hadrian raised the city to the rank of metropolis in 123 AD and ranked it ahead of Ephesus and Smyrna. There was an ambitious building program that included massive temples, a stadium, a theater, and a forum that we'll all look at here in a few minutes. At the city limits, there was the shrine to Asclepius, which was the healing god, that was expanded into a lavish spa that we'll also do a separate video log about that one. In the 2nd century AD, Pergamum was one of the largest cities in the province with probably 200,000 inhabitants. By the 3rd century AD, the city began to decline. The economic strength of the city collapsed and it was badly damaged in an earthquake in 262 AD. It was also sacked by the Goths, which is that Germanic tribe, shortly thereafter, and the city experienced only limited economic recovery. In the Byzantine period after Constantine the Great, Pergamum was captured by raiding Arabs for the first time in about 663 or 664 AD. At that point, the settlers and residents in Pergamum kind of retracted back to the Acropolis for their protection. But by the Middle Byzantine era, the Arabs had attacked again in 1109 and largely destroyed the city. So with that in mind, I'm now going to turn our attention to the specific sites and scenery on the Pergamos Acropolis. Here we're looking at the walls of the Acropolis, and I'm going to show you a model of the city that will kind of give the layout of where everything is located that I'll be talking about as we go through the continuation of this video log. Here's a picture of the model that you see after you get off the gondola at the top of the acropolis. I'll warn you, it's not to scale, but at least it gives you a sense of what you're looking at and where we are, as shown by the red arrow right in front of the wall that I was showing in pictures a moment ago. Here's the temple of Trajan that we'll see as we go through our tour, and the next one is showing here the temple or sanctuary of Athena that we'll also be talking about. This arrow is pointing there at the stadium that we'll see lots of photographs about as we go through. The arrow is now pointing at the temple of Zeus that I will talk about as we go through this process. And finally there you see the temple of Dionysus, which is down toward the very bottom, and we'll talk about that. Our tour of the Acropolis begins with the sanctuary or temple of Athena that's shown here in this photograph to give the location generally. In order to get here, we've got to go through this arched gateway through this wall that will then take us up into the temple itself. The temple of Athena is actually Pergamum's oldest temple, and it dates back to the 4th century BC. Needless to say, it was dedicated to Athena, who was the goddess of defensive war. Her contemporaries were Mars and Ares, who were also considered gods of war, but she's the goddess of defensive war and brings victory to Zeus. The myth is that she was born fully armed for battle, so definitely not someone who you want to meet in a dark alley. Now, with regard to her temple, it was north-facing with 6 columns on the short side and 10 columns on the long side. It also had a cella divided into 2 rooms. The foundations were about 30 feet by 66 feet, which are still visible today. The temple columns were in the Doric style, which basically means they were kind of plain Jane. They were about 15 feet high and 2 feet in diameter, with the distance between the columns at about 4.5 feet. The colonnade for this temple was very light given the time period in which this temple was built. In addition, the columns were unfluted, and some even retained bossage, which means it had uncut stone in some of the columns. That means that the craftsmen were either careless or the columns were incomplete. The temple had a 2-story stoa surrounding it on 3 sides that was added by King Eumenes of Pergamum. I mentioned him during my historical overview, and it was on his watch that the city reached the height of its grandeur during the Greek era. The temple also had a propylone in the southeast corner, largely reconstructed in the Pergamum Museum in Berlin, of all places. The story behind the story of the propylone ending up at Berlin comes from the fact that the German archaeologists were some of the earliest to begin excavations at this site, and so the propylone and also the Temple of Zeus ended up in Berlin for that reason. Now, in addition to the propylone, the round base that you see here in the center of the temple had a statue of Augustus, who was the emperor of Rome. He reigned from 31 BC to 14 AD, so he was the Roman emperor at the time that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. So that concludes my discussion of the Temple of Athena, but I have a few more pictures that you can look at and listen to some music before we move on to the library at Pergamum. We're now moving on to the library on the Acropolis of Pergamum. It was located on the northern side of the Temple of Athena, although the location is somewhat uncertain. It was added by King Eumenes II, who I mentioned a moment ago. This library was the second largest in the ancient Greek world after the library at Alexandria. It contained at least 200,000 scrolls right up until the time that they were taken by Mark Antony and presented to Cleopatra of Egypt, his girlfriend, in 41 BC. I mean, the things people do to impress a girl, right? But at any rate, the library included a reduced-size statue of Athena on a pedestal in the library. We're now ready to move on to the temple of the Emperor Trajan, but before we get to this structure specifically, I wanted to talk about the ancient architectural styles that existed during this time. The first was the Doric style that I mentioned a moment ago as this kind of plain Jane. This style consisted of large columns with these plain round capitals at the top, and a lot of times they didn't have any base associated with them. The second type was the Ionic. This architectural style included slender columns with a scroll or a palm leaf ornament with the capitals on top of them. They also had bases and more of the vertical fluting that you'll see here in the Temple of Trajan. Now the third type was the Corinthian style. It's a very ornate type of style. The columns were very ornate and the capitals had these leaf motifs, essentially very grandiose. So as you look at the structure of Trajan, you're going to see a lot of the Corinthian style that you can kind of pick out and distinguish from the two earlier architectural styles that I mentioned a moment ago. So the Temple of Trajan sits on the highest point of the citadel. The construction began when Trajan was the emperor between 98 and 117 AD, but it was also enlarged and completed by his successor Emperor Hadrian. The Temple of Trajan is the only Roman monument on the upper fortress, or what I've been referring to as the acropolis. All the rest are from the Greek and Hellenistic era before the Roman period. This temple is also called the Temple of Zeus Philios, meaning both Zeus and Trajan were worshipped in this temple. They had some type of rent sharing or something, I guess. But at any rate, the fact that Trajan has this temple dedicated to him is another indication of the imperial cult, or the worship of emperors, that was very active in the time of the Roman period, and it presented a lot of problems for the Christians living in this time period. Now, Trajan was the emperor during the period not long after John wrote the book of Revelation in 96 AD. Essentially, Trajan comes on the scene about 98 AD. As far as emperors go, he was somewhat moderate toward the Christians. He gave them a certain measure of due process, so that when they were presented before his provincial governors and things of this nature, they basically were not looked for, but if they were found and they refused to deny the Christ, then they would be executed. But his instructions to Pliny were essentially, don't go looking for them, and if they're willing to worship the emperor, then we're not going to execute them, even though they historically have been recognized as Christians. So that's a little bit about who Trajan was, and this is essentially his temple. The temple was 54 feet in diameter, with 6 columns on the short sides and 9 columns on the long sides. The north area was closed off by a high stoa, which is a covered walkway or portico. The west and east sides were surrounded by simple ashlar walls until further stoas were added during Hadrian's reign. During excavations, they actually found fragments of the statues of Trajan and Hadrian in the rubble. They knew it was them because basically they found their heads. Before this temple could be built, they actually had to do a lot of earthwork, including the creation of the terraces on which the temple actually sits. This required them to create these open arched areas to support the groundwork underneath the temple foundation. And so up until the time of about the Middle Ages, these terraces continued to exist, but then they were turned into water cisterns, which you can see in some of the photographs that I'm showing you in this area. So that gives you some idea what was going on with the Temple of Trajan, and this concludes my discussion of that temple. I have some more photos that I think you'll enjoy along with some background music, but I'm going to conclude this video log at this point as well because it's getting a little bit long and you can only take so much of me in one sitting. So I'm going to continue our discussion of the Acropolis in a part 2 video log, and I'll start out right where I leave off today. So thanks for watching, sharing, subscribing, and all those things you do. I'll see you for Pergamos part 2 in the very near future, so enjoy.